warm welcome to our guest, Shri Shyam Saran ji, our speaker of the 8th Pupul Jayakar Memorial Lecture, to the Chairman INTAC, Major General Gupta, Your Excellencies, our esteemed guests, our founder members, other members of INTAC, and all our well-wishers. Since the year 2011, INTAC has started the tradition of holding the Pupul Jayakar Memorial Lecture on 18th April, which is the World Heritage Day. Once again, we welcome you to this talk on cultural diplomacy and leveraging India's soft power, and hope that you will enjoy the lecture. Thank you.
INTAC is one of the most important centers of excellence in our country, dedicated to the preservation and promotion of Indian culture and historical legacy. And as we have seen through the publications which have been launched today, this evening, that it has done a considerable amount of work on a whole range of subjects related to preserving our cultural heritage. And it is no surprise that, like several other sister institutions, INTAC also owes its existence to Pupul Jayakar's initiative. She was passionate about India's art and culture, its craft traditions, its intangible cultural assets, such as folk songs, storytelling. She was, in every sense, an embodiment of the finest sensibilities bequeathed to us by India's rich cultural and spiritual heritage. She was as much at home with the country's vivid and colorful tribal culture as she was with the complex aesthetics and layered symbolism of its most classical and elevated art forms. In fact, it would be fair to say that the entire spectrum of art, from the tribal to the formal, from crafts to classical forms, was to her a seamless continuity. Pupul Jayakar was influenced very deeply by theosophy and became a follower of one of its best known spiritual masters, J. Krishnamurti. And one of my very treasured possessions is an autographed copy of a celebrated biography of the spiritual guide and teacher. This was her gift to me when we were holding the Festival of India in Japan in 1987-88, which is perhaps one of our most successful forays in cultural diplomacy, showcasing the breathtaking range of cultural experiences that India has to offer. The festival in Japan, just like the earlier festivals in the United States and France, was meticulously choreographed by Pupul Jayakar. As coordinator of the festival in the Indian Embassy in Japan, I had the rare privilege of working closely with her, putting in place nearly 30 events, performing arts, theater, exhibitions, fashion shows, and film festivals, which eventually covered as many locations also throughout Japan. And one of the great things was that the Japanese TV channels carried about 100 hours of programming on these cultural events, and all this was achieved without having to pay any cost for such publicity. And this brought Indian culture really as a living phenomena into the homes of millions of Japanese. And over this veritable cultural feast, of course, presided Pupul Jayakar, not inappropriately known as the Tsarina of Indian culture. So I'm very honored to have been invited to deliver this address in her memory. The Festivals of India, which have now been institutionalized, were conceived by her and embody in practical form what cultural diplomacy should be about, demonstrating its capacity to deliver impacts that often elude traditional diplomacy, to which it still plays second and even third fiddle. I believe, and this is from my own experience in the service, that the role of culture in international affairs is consistently underestimated and therefore underinvested in. And what is cultural diplomacy? Actually, culture provides the operating context for politics. It is the prism through which people perceive each other, nations interpret each other, and mediate their differences and also celebrate their affinities. The state has a key role to play, but not an exclusive role, because culture relates to people, their deep-seated attitudes and way of living. Cultural diplomacy pursued by the state is most effective when it plays an enabling role, providing opportunities, platforms, and resources for people themselves to get into the business of engaging, debating, and sharing their cultural lives with counterparts in other countries. This may be in the form of art, language, literature, history, performing arts, theatre, or just even workshops and seminars. The range of cultural exchanges really has very few limits. The mutual familiarity, awareness, and understanding created through such encounters generates what I call cultural literacy. And cultural literacy is indispensable to acquiring a capacity to interpret actions by other states and navigate the inherent diversity that characterizes interstate relations. And what may positively influence one state may mar relations with another. There is no standard formula or a generic template. Each country and its people are unique, and their cultural particularities need to be understood, even while making the effort to help them understand our own culture. Diplomacy is anchored in cross-cultural engagement, which engenders a cultivated sensitivity to the cultural idiom of a country one is dealing with. It is this sensitivity which confers the ability in a diplomat, for example, to sense the shifts in moods and expressions of his interlocutor and read the clues to a reality that often lies hidden behind formal articulations. I would go further and add that it is not only familiarity with other cultures that it is necessary for a diplomat to discharge his duties effectively, there is also need for what I call cultural empathy. One needs to have almost a compelling curiosity about the culture of a country one is exposed to, its history, customs, traditions, and yes, also the dreams and aspirations of its peoples. This applies to friend and adversary alike. The ability to locate current interaction in a broader cultural context may help enhance the positive and limit the negative impact on interstate relations. This enables genuine dialogue and not merely conversations. Now, let me take you back to the Festival of India in Japan to demonstrate the power of culture to project in a rather powerful manner what we are very proud of, the inclusive, accommodative, and secular fabric of India. So at the inauguration of the Festival of India in Tokyo, the inaugural concert had a very moving rendition by the Dagar brothers, the very famous Dagar brothers, who at this particular concert sang the Shiva Stuti. And this really held the entire Japanese audience spellbound, just the singing. And after the inaugural ceremony was over, there was a small reception where the then Prime Minister of India, Rajiv Gandhi, and the then Prime Minister of Japan, Takashita, were meeting some of the distinguished guests. But Takashita then asked Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, I would like to meet these two singers who sang this wonderful song at the inaugural. I would like to have a meeting with them. And so the Daga brothers came to the foyer, and Takashita asked one of them, that is Aminuddin, what is the song that you were singing? And Aminuddin said that this was actually an ancient invocation to Lord Shiva, seeking his mercy and benediction. So Takashita sort of expressed surprise, exclaiming, "But aren't you a Muslim?" And Aminuddin replied, "Yes, I am a Muslim, but also a devotee of Shiva. I pay homage to Allah through my song in praise of Shiva." Several of these events were planned in Bali. And Bali, of course, the affinities, cultural affinities with India are quite obvious. And the then governor of Bali was very keen. It was perhaps one of the most successful events we had, because the inauguration, which was in a hall where there were perhaps space for about 750 people. There were maybe double the number of people. There were people standing outside. There were screens on which they could watch, the concert taking place inside. The Bali governor and all his cabinet was present in the audience, and the inaugural concert was a flute recital by Hari Prasad Chaurasia ji. And the flute is actually a very is one of the favored instruments in Bali. So it was very appropriate in a sense that there was this flute recital. And Hari Prasad ji dedicated his recital to the people who had died in Bali, and said that this is music which I hope, as the governor says, will heal some of the wounds that you have suffered. And it was, very moving sort of experience. There were a lot of people in the audience who were actually crying, but it was a hugely successful event. And the next day, when I was walking around the center of Bali, of course, people had seen me on the on the television in the evening before. So I had absolutely ordinary Balinese coming up to me, holding my hand, shaking my hand, and saying, "Thank you very much." And I think the impact that just that made, in terms of just creating this immense amount of goodwill for India, immense sense of cultural affinity with India, I think was quite unprecedented. So it was a very personal experience of what culture can do, really, to bring countries together. I also wanted to, of course, mention about my other experiences in Southeast Asia, because I served also in Myanmar and visited several countries in Southeast Asia. Now, we have several programs of cultural and academic exchanges with Southeast Asia. But one problem that I have found, and I think this is important in terms of our cultural diplomacy, that we often lack modesty in speaking about our cultural affinities. Some Indian scholars alienate their Southeast Asian counterparts by suggesting that Southeast Asia got all its culture and art from India. It is true that throughout Southeast and even East Asia, one encounters the colors and echoes of India everywhere. But whatever cultural assets they may have borrowed from India, our neighbors to the east have transformed these into exquisite examples of local genius and creativity. What has been at work here is not cultural imposition, but a creative exchange that enriched both. And to watch a performance, for example, of the Javanese Ramayan at the ancient Prambanan temple at Jogjakarta is exciting precisely because its Indian origins have been lovingly reworked with local flavors to create an uniquely Indonesian product. We see what is Indian in it, but mostly neglect the beauty of the layers of color and meaning that Indonesians have added to it throughout the ages. So we need to be humble in claiming cultural parentage. Pride, if any, should be in rejoicing that our ancestors provided a cultural spark which led to such a powerful surge of creativity and artistic expression in our extended neighborhood. Cultural diplomacy should enable a joint journey of exploration of this historical process, because this was a cultural encounter which I believe was unparalleled elsewhere in the world. Even in the Indian subcontinent, which is a shared cultural space, there is need for sensitivity towards the inherent anxiety which our neighbors often have about their own cultural identity being overwhelmed by the power of Indian culture. Cultural affinity needs to be pursued with humility and a readiness to acknowledge the many contributions made by neighboring countries in enriching our shared culture of the subcontinent. Of course, the success of Bollywood has been spoken about, and as I mentioned to you, that we had a Bollywood extravaganza as the final event in the Festival of India in Indonesia, and we had a whole stadium for this particular event, and there was almost a stampede. And the most interesting thing was that, of course, I had not invited the president of Indonesia, Megawati Soekarno Putri, because I thought, well, maybe this is not something that the president would want to attend. until I got a telephone call from the presidential palace saying the president is not happy that she has not been invited to this Bollywood extravaganza. So of course we had to send an immediate invitation for her. I mean, Bollywood is also an example of how there is so much of cultural assets that we actually possess, which we don't fully we are not fully aware of, and we do not really leverage as much as we perhaps can. Now, I attach value to cultural diplomacy for another reason, and which has to do with the excitement of discovering the many treasures of India's own cultural heritage, lost to us because of loot and plunder or the ravages of time and weather, which actually lie embedded in the cultures of the many countries which constituted India's extended neighborhood through the centuries. This extended neighborhood was defined by the monsoon winds, which linked peninsular India with the countries of Southeast Asia, as we saw, as well as the Far East, including China, the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, as far as the east coast of Africa on its western flank. But there was also the many centuries of interaction with Central Asia along the caravan routes threading across the high mountains and deserts of the north. And the Mughal Empire created a very unique Indo-Persian cultural space, whose fascinating story has been detailed in a recent book by Audrey Truschke called Cultural Encounters, specifically talking about Sanskrit at the Mughal court. So India is what I call a crossroads culture, its cosmopolitan temper, its embrace of plurality, is being the precious legacy of its lying astride both the maritime and the caravan routes of the past. It had much to give to its neighborhood, and the colors and echoes, as I said, of India are to be found throughout this extended neighborhood. Equally, one must acknowledge our own culture carries the imprint of what we learned from our neighbors both far and near. And the exploration of the history, philosophical traditions, languages and scripts, sacred literature, architectural forms, and art idioms of countries in this extended neighborhood is one of the most important missions, I believe, of cultural diplomacy. This exploration has to be a shared enterprise with our partner states. This will reveal as much of our own history and culture as it would theirs, and through this will be born a stronger sense of affinity, a shared frame of reference which more traditional diplomacy can draw upon. So during my assignments in China, Japan, Indonesia, Nepal, Myanmar, and visits to Tibet and to Xinjiang, I was always struck by how much of India's own sacred literature, both Hindu and Buddhist, were preserved in temples and monasteries and even in modern libraries in these countries. There were original texts in Sanskrit and Pali. There were also translations in local languages. Let me share with you an example from Japan. While I was serving in Japan, I had the opportunity to visit the ancient monastery town of Koyasan, which is just outside the ancient capital of Kyoto. And Koyasan is associated with the name of a very famous Japanese monk called Kobodaishi, the great master, who was a Buddhist monk and who lived from 774 to 835 AD. And like many other Japanese Buddhist monks, Kobodaishi also traveled to China to spend several years in the ancient Chinese capital of Xi'an, where he learned Sanskrit and studied Buddhist scriptures. And his teacher was an Indian scholar called Pandit Pranya, who had come all the way from Nalanda, which in those days was truly the knowledge capital of Asia. And on his return to Japan, Kobodaishi introduced the Sanskrit syllabary, Kakha in the Siddham script, which was in use at that time, to the Japanese language. And this forms the basis of what is known as the katakana, the supplemental phonetic alphabet, which is used together with Chinese characters or kanji to better reflect, what the Japanese sounds. But Kobodaishi also brought with him a very large stock of Buddhist scriptures. Uh, they were Sanskrit texts, as I mentioned, but there were also secular texts on astronomy, on medicine, scholarly commentaries, and these are all stored in a very ancient library dating back to the 8th century in Koyasa. It's a very large wooden structure, and these are all kept very carefully there. In fact, this library is known as a national treasure in Japan. And Kobodaishi's, he has a catalog of imported items which is available. It gives us an idea of the wealth of invaluable historical, sacred, and secular texts which he had accumulated over many years in Siam, and which are not only a cultural legacy of Japan, but they are a cultural legacy of India as well. And very few Indians know about it. Uh, of course, the reason why they survived in Japan was that this particular monastery town for hundreds of years had been in a sense insulated from civil strife or wars or even natural disasters. So it has survived to this age. But this is one of the few places where you actually have original texts which go back several hundred years. And similarly, you have the period of the 8th to the 12th century, which was one of intense cultural, indeed knowledge exchange between India and the Arab world, with Central Asia playing the role of an intermediary. And this has been very meticulously chronicled in Frederick Starr's, the book is called Lost Enlightenment. During this 500-year period, Central Asia was invaded by the Arabs, and Arabic soon became the lingua franca of the entire Islamic world, stretching from the margins of Europe to the edges of the Indian subcontinent. And classic Sanskrit texts on Indian medicine, mathematics, philosophy traveled to Central Asia, where they were translated into Arabic and then transmitted to the Arab Peninsula. So the medical treatises of Charak and Shushruta, the mathematical and astronomical theories of Aryabhat and Brahmgupta, these were all translated into Arabic by well-known Central Asian scholars like Khwarazmi, Ibn Sina, Al-Biruni. Several of these treatises were actually already available in Persian from an earlier exchange between India and Iran. These include, for example, the 6th century Persian translations of Panchatantra and the Hitopadesh. These in turn found their way to Europe, becoming part of the European Renaissance from the 12th century onwards. We all know about the Indian numeral system, the concept of shunya or zero, the decimal, the calculation of pi, the notion of negative numbers, integers. These are all part of India's intellectual legacy, which spread far beyond its borders, including to Europe and China. The world today presents, of course, very new challenges to the practice of cultural diplomacy. At one end of the spectrum, the communications and information revolutions have brought humanity much closer than any time in history. There are vastly expanded opportunities to directly experience other cultures through travel or to learn about them through virtual media. There is a continual exposure to different ways of life, cultural norms, and traditions and cuisine. An International Yoga Day has made this quintessentially Indian heritage a global phenomenon and reinforced India's soft power. This increasing interaction among different countries, peoples, and cultures is leading to cultural enrichment, a growing appreciation of what is best in every culture, and hopefully a heightened cultural sensitivity to the particularities of individual cultures. The intensity of cultural interaction is leading to a burst of creativity and intellectual ferment across the world. And this is welcome, and this is impacting India as well. And at the same UK study, which I mentioned earlier on cultural diplomacy, says, quote, as opportunities for global contact and exchange are proliferating as never before, and because of these contacts, culture itself is changing. And the final line says, cultures are meeting mingling and morphing. But there is also a dark side that has been unleashed by the same proximity. For example, the fear of a loss of identity, a sense of being culturally adrift in a world being transformed with unprecedented rapidity. Indian culture has been constantly evolving, changing, and adding new layers of experience, but always retaining the eternal strands that define its identity. But there are times when we tend to reject the present and the promise of the future in favor of a remembered past and ancient glory. But as Nehru observed in a comment about culture, this was a time when the ICCR was being set up, a nation cannot prosper if it merely imitates its ancestors. What builds a nation is creative, inventive, and vital activity, unquote. So mechanical imitation inhibits the process of engagement and dialogue, not only between cultures, but between generations born into the same culture. Instead of celebrating diversity and sharing cultural experiences, we begin to raise walls around us and seek to stifle the very impulses which keep our culture alive and vibrant. And I very strongly believe that a culture that does not share will soon stagnate and die. Cultural diplomacy is all about sharing, not showing. I truly believe that open and liberal societies, in particular plural democracies like our own, are far better equipped to successfully navigate the increasingly congested world which is emerging. The hallmark of a great and successful power of the future will be the ability of its people to handle diversity, adapt to different cultures. In seeking our own place in the world, India should be careful not to devalue the very strengths we possess as a confident and accommodative, indeed, an assimilative culture. We must not encourage a political culture which feeds on division, exploiting fears of the loss of imagined identities and creating a sense of siege. Our democracy is a citizen-based democracy. Individual eccentricity has always found place in our culture, and we must retain space for every individual to give full play to his genius, free from narrowly defined cultural categories or uninformed prejudices. If we are to engage other cultures in a productive dialogue, we must reaffirm confidence in our own and learn to accept and celebrate the diversity that lies at the heart of the very idea of India. Let me conclude by going back to Nehru, whom I consider a very rare example of a modern Indian, steeped in his country's innate cultural values and yet conscious of India's myriad connections and even indebtedness to other cultures of the world. Nehru considered nationalism as a limiting concept because, from his point of view, nationalism considered civilizations as unitary creations. But civilizations had emerged from interconnections with each other, and India more so than others. Therefore, he said, the history of one society necessarily required knowing the history of other societies. It is this exciting adventure of mutual discovery that, to me, what cultural diplomacy is all about. And this is the message that Pupul Jayakar sought to convey through the festivals of India, and which is more than relevant today. Thank you for your attention.